There's one thing I want to show you, and that's basically how we can convert this to a standard terrain, retaining the bump with the current material. I do want to save this camera that I've set up, and I'm going to call it Group D, and this is for the distant render and the much higher up one. We're going to save it, and it looks like maybe there was just a little bit of a problem. So it looks like there's a problem with the camera in this scene. I'm going to go ahead and reload it. I might have hit something by accident, which is another reason I like to use those meta nodes to fix the camera position for the stills, just because that way you won't run into any of those problems. I'm going to go back to the main camera, and we'll just keep camera 3, which is the distant. And what I want to do is just break down and scale down the terrain. And we're not going to be using any zones. We're just going to physically scale it down, just moving the object. And as we can see, it is not updating. So I'm going to go ahead and double click on the terrain, let that refresh, click OK. And then we should see it update in the scene. So let's just take, and I'm going to go ahead and move this over a little bit more. And we're going to use the same technique that we had earlier, where we converted it to a standard terrain, but now we have a material. So I just want to show you how to get that bump information to get that nice detailed look on the terrain without destroying the material. And that's another reason why we left the bump channel open. Now we can combine the procedural for the terrain on the bump with other materials by using combiners, because then that information is still there. But let's go ahead and take our landscape, edit the object, and I still have this altitude reduction saved out, so I'm going to be loading that in. We'll edit the object, and I'm going to increase our pixel resolution, and I'm going to end up using the resize option just so we don't have to go through all the different steps of calculation. So we go to resize, and I'm just going to set this to 512 by 512. Since we have a much smaller terrain, this is going to look much better than the old one did at this resolution. And then we can go ahead and convert this over to a standard terrain. If you have made changes to the terrain, then you will not want to make sure you save out the altitude reduction as a different fractal file. And I probably should have mentioned this before I converted over the standard terrain. One thing I have done, and it's kind of important, is making sure you go through the environment tab of all of the objects and making sure that everything set is at an absolute value for range of altitude. The reason for this is we do not want the by object mode because we've reduced the size of the terrain. If anything's set to by object, and the only time we were using by object before was to have the minimum and maximum values set, so that wouldn't affect this scene at all. But I have set everything to the absolute, and it looks like some of the stuff was not saved over. Of course, in this case, it doesn't really matter, like I said, because the size change. And what we currently had on the terrain, the only time we were using object mode was basically when we were using the maximum minimum value. It just looked like there was that one I had left out. But you do want to set that to the absolute mode just because the overall scale of your terrain has changed. So if in the larger version of the terrain you had higher peaks, that would count as the object. and affect the overall material. So you will want to make sure you make those changes. So one thing we need to do before we can bring in our bump, and we're just going to set this up ahead of time, what we're going to be using is the lowest layer, which is our light rock, and our base layer. And what we're going to have set up is no effect on bump from any of the other material layers. So in order to set this up, what we need to do is go up through the set of materials, and in the bump tab, set the depth to 0, and for the add to underlying layer bumps, we're going to set that to add. And I've already gone through and cleared out any bump that was on the channel. So you also want to make sure you go into the function and just clear out any sort of bump. So we set the depth to 0, replace, set it to 100% being add. So we're adding nothing basically, but unless we set it to add, we have the replace value, which is going to replace it with nothing. So all of those have now been set up, and without those settings, you won't see the bump at all. So now we can load in the function for the terrain. And before I had set the depth amount to a very high value. Now, if you're going to be mixing other bumps with it, then you won't want to have the depth set that high because it's going to be difficult to mix anything with it, just because you're going to end up with an extremely large amount of bump on the other channels. Although you can use filters and reduce them, one thing you may want to do is increase the gain amount within the actual nodes themselves. And just as long as you don't make any other changes, it won't affect the overall shape. In this case, I don't really have anything added, so just for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to type in a value of 10. And if I need to increase the roughness on all of our channels, I can do that, or all of the nodes that make up this terrain. So now we're going to be able to render this very quickly. Because we have such a small area, we're able to work with the environment just about the same as before, and it shouldn't affect the materials as much just because we're working with a much smaller version of the terrain. Before we had created that standard version that was much larger. Another thing you can do is create multiple terrains. If you run into that problem where I had before, where the larger pixel resolutions were crashing, then you could have duplicates of the object, set them side by side, and convert them to standard. And then they'll match up along the edges. And then you can even have different resolutions if you want. Farther away, you could have a lower resolution. And then you'll be able to set up specific zones. And I'm going to go ahead and just render this out, and we can see how much quicker we'll be able to render. Granted, it is still going to have to populate the ecosystem, so we'll have to keep that in mind as well. But the immediate population and processing of the terrain is extremely quick because there's no longer that need to process the procedural terrain, which ends up taking longer than anything else. With animation, it's more of a drawback just because as the camera's moving, you have to refresh the terrain, or View is refreshing the geometry to add the new areas. If the camera is stationary, then the same geometry data will be used for the next renders. But the ecosystem population also ties into that, because if there's no geometry, it can't be populated. So it'll have to populate the terrain and create the geometry, and then populate the ecosystem. So right now we've got an extremely fast render compared to before with the procedural terrain, which we had to process, of course, that geometry. So even when you're working and trying to perfect the ecosystem, at this point, if I wanted to work a little closer with the current ecosystem or the materials, add to the bumps, anything like that, I would be using this version just because it renders and processes so much quicker. If I need to change the camera angle, don't have to worry about that refresh. And for animation, this will really, really speed up your renders. Provided you have a high enough pixel quality, you won't have to worry about any of the shadow issues. And as we are going over before, you can increase the softness option of the sunlight, or change that over to a different type of mapping mode. You can change from ray tracing over to shadow maps and blur those out if needed. But we have a pretty quick render going on. So if you need to go to these smaller zones, or if this would be farther away from the camera, you can set up your pixel resolution, and this is just a really, really nice way to be able to get rid of the procedural terrain. In this case, I didn't apply any sort of erosion effects, so we do have a little bit of pixelation, some weird shadows, which normally happens whenever you convert a procedural terrain to a standard terrain. Adding just a tiny little bit of dissolve erosion will smooth out any of that. And since we have the actual fractal we use to build the terrain as the bump, it'll fill in any of the details in the right places, and you won't have to worry about that loss of that little tiny bit of geometry. So overall, I think it looks pretty good. Like I was saying before, if I was to spend a little more time on this, I'd definitely improve the quality of the materials and maybe have some dead leaves areas underneath all of the larger forest areas, which we can just use the fractals we use to control the density, to control the alpha of that sort of color of dead leaves or branches or even texture maps. If you get really close and you decide you want a texture map, then you'd be able to use that alpha as well. So it's pretty versatile, and there's a lot you can do with this method and these steps. Being able to break down the scene. If you're going to be adjusting lighting at all, this is also a stage of the scene where you'd like to do that because it is so fast to render. And although, like I said, the shadows aren't perfect, those can be improved. Simple fix, and the scene performance is just extremely fast compared to before. So this scene is saved out as group E0001. And I'm going to go ahead and save that out again, just in the current state. And you'll be able to load in this version I have. And then you could also save out this material too as another version now that it has the bump, but just making sure that all those bump channels have the depth amount set to 0, add to underlying layer bumps at 100%, except the first or the lowest material, which actually contains the bump, and that's where we have the depth and the actual bump channel. So I hope you've enjoyed the training and learned a little bit more about creating scenes within Vue for dynamic population, also terrain management, and just good ways to break down the overall scenes. And feel free to use any of the variations I've created for your own scenes. There's no license, those are royalty free. So go ahead and play around with those if you want, use them for your own ecosystems. I am leaving out the dead tree variations since there was a problem with the variation, so you can use the native species for those. But since I set up all the renaming of all the other plants, feel free to use them. They can be pretty useful. They do need a little bit of material tweak, I think, for the color, but other than that, they should be sufficient.